This is part 1 of the unit on popular stereotypes of Africa. The first 4 parts of this unit are focused on wilderness. This first part will consider the idea of wilderness. Let's look at where the concept of wilderness came from. Let's consider how it was transported to the African colonies and how it became the foundation upon which African national parks were built. We'll begin by recognizing that wilderness is itself as much an idea as something that really exists, and we'll look at the impacts of protecting, really creating spaces of wilderness in a contemporary context. I think you'll agree with me that there is a common stereotype that Africa is the quintessential site of wilderness. This photo was taken by Professor Lundstrom in South Africa's Kruger National Park. It's similar to images we receive from National Geographic and Sea and Nature specials. In this discourse, Africa is seen as being a vast primitive landscape. It's portrayed as a Garden of Eden, unchanged by the hands of time. This way of seeing Africa gives you the feeling that you're going back in time. You get the sense that such landscapes are timeless and have a wild, uncontained spirit. In fact, you can get this message in your local TTC subway station. This is an advertisement for Amarula, a South African liqueur, and these photographs were taken in Bay Street Station. Africa is now available in Canada. Well, what about Africa is now available in Canada, besides Amarula? The elephant? No, not exactly. It's the spirit of Africa. Well, what exactly is this spirit? Wildlife. Wildlife is the spirit of Africa. Here you see a line of elephants, but you also see a landscape. The spirit of Africa is a wild landscape uninhabited by people. It's wilderness, the apparent timeless essence of Africa. Let's move back 100 or so years ago and to North America now, to the United States, and we'll see that this concept of wilderness is itself really quite a recent invention, and we'll see that there's nothing timeless about wilderness. For this discussion, I'm drawing on Roderick Newman's important book entitled Imposing Wilderness: Struggles Over Livelihood and Nature Preservation in Africa. In this book, he explores the origins of the concept of wilderness, what he calls its philosophical foundations. Prior to the 19th century, wilderness had negative connotations in the Euro-American imagination. It was something ominous and threatening, something to be feared, a space you didn't enter unless you had to. This attitude was strong among early European settlers in the eastern United States, confronted with expanses of temperate forests. Around the mid-19th century, we see a shift in how wilderness is seen. Landscapes of wilderness came to be seen as sublime, as pure. This is Yosemite National Park. Not merely beautiful, but rather awe-inspiring spaces of vastness and grandeur, where we feel God's power, this Judeo-Christian component. John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, described the wilderness landscape of Yosemite National Park's Hetch Hetchy Valley as one of nature's rarest and most precious mountain temples. The sublime rocks of its walls seem to glow with life. So by the mid to late 1800s, we see the rise of Euro-American critique of modernity and of urbanization. We see hostility towards modernity and urbanization and what they represented. In this emerging view, cities and factories were seen as confining, stifling, and alienating. A nostalgia emerged for what was seen as simpler times. Wilderness offered a place where one could go back to a simpler time, to escape the problems and complexities of the modern world. By 1900, wilderness had become both sublime and a place to escape the ills of modernity and modern urban society. This was a profound transformation in the concept of wilderness. 19th century American romantic discourses of the wilderness drew heavily from the English aesthetic tradition of sublime nature. According to Newman, American Romanticism eventually played a leading role in the development of the national park and wilderness ideals in the United States. To fully grasp the concept of wilderness as we understand it today, we need to consider the historical phenomenon of the closing of the American frontier. By the 1890s, Western movement and settlement had reached its limit, the Pacific coast. For European settlers, the U.S. western frontier was coming to a close. Here you see a photo of a homestead family in Nebraska. There was fear that the wild spaces of the frontier were fading away. They were being destroyed by Western expansion and urban industrial capitalism. Why would this be a problem? An early 20th century historian named Jackson Turner said that the idea of wild spaces had become crucial to the American national identity. He and other scholars argued that wild country, or wilderness, the frontier, was the quintessential location for experiencing being American. They said that such spaces of wilderness embodied American values of democracy, love of adventure, independence, rugged individualism. They said that these spaces are what differentiated the U.S. from Europe, that Europe had great temples and cathedrals, while Americans had natural temples like Yosemite and Yellowstone. Wilderness also was important to Canadian national identity, though with some differences. So as the U.S. frontier began to close in the late 1800s, there was anxiety that this would bring with it profound loss of a way of life, of the rugged frontier, of the individualist explorer who was always white and masculine. This figure was embodied in Daniel Boone and the U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, so this involved loss of what made America both great and distinct. Ultimately, losing wilderness was about losing the country's character. To protect American values and identity, that which defined its difference from Europe, the American government began to set aside vast wild landscapes, primarily in the U.S. West. And there was an urgency to protect these spaces of wilderness, because it was about protecting the American spirit. Notice that wild country was a particularly raced, gendered, and classed space. It was a space for white, masculine, and masculinist wealthy adventurers. The irony was that the urban industrial capitalists who created the urban spaces that were of concern were among those who believed that they must escape their debilitating effects. After the U.S. Civil War, the nation's wealthiest citizens sought out wilderness, and as such, to this day, wilderness still has this reputation as middle class. There's also a scholarly debate as to whether this characterizes Canada as well. As a result, the U.S. government created national parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone. Yellowstone is said to be the first national park in the world, and it was founded in 1872. Underlying the creation of U.S. national parks is the national park ideal. This notion has a number of characteristics. First, nature is preserved from human intervention by designating these national parks. Second, nature is a space without people, or at least without modern people. This strict distinction between nature and society is key, and as such, land is set apart to protect the American essence and identity. Another irony is that indigenous peoples were removed in order to protect these lands from humans. What was presumably wild, land untouched by human hands, had in fact been occupied for thousands of years. These spaces were made to look wild by removing indigenous communities. Early Park Service publications referred to indigenous peoples as early visitors, with no legitimate claim as owners, and for all these centuries they were simply visiting. Keep this in mind as I discuss what happened in Africa's national parks. The third element of the notion of the national park ideal is that wilderness became something to be appreciated for its beauty, nature, understood as scenery, something you look at or visit, not a place where you live. And again, we're seeing a distinction between nature and society. Humans are not part of nature in this vision. These qualities were embodied in parks like Yellowstone since their inception. Also, important to the national park ideal is that they used legislation to create a bounded space for nature, and this bounded space was controlled by a centralized bureaucratic authority. Newman says that the critical component, symbolically and practically, of the law that created Yellowstone as a model for all the world's national parks was the prohibition against human settlement and activities. This clause reflected the focus on the so-called essence of the landscape, involved the removal of all evidence of human labor, and involved the separation of the observer from the land. This was part of a wider trend in capitalism towards the spatial division of production and consumption. National parks became the quintessential landscape of consumption for modern society. Here's the key points of the national park ideal laid out. I want to contrast this with a different example, also from North America. I want to mention Chapultepec, a park in Mexico City that was established 700 years ago by the Mexica, also known as the Aztecs. The Aztec emperor, Chimalpopoca, designated this park to protect the water source for Mexico City, then called Tenochtitlan. The Mexica built an aqueduct between 1440 and 1469 to bring fresh water to the city. You can see the aqueduct here in the photograph. The city then had about 200,000 inhabitants and a level of infrastructure that the first Europeans that arrived had never seen. As the city was on an island at that time in the middle of a saltwater lake, Chapultepec Park, located to the west of the city, provided fresh water to its inhabitants. For the Mexica, this park, although always beautiful, was never isolated from the people, and in fact served as a ceremonial space. Now, this park is within the urban space of the world city that Mexico City has become. Its existence for over 500 years prior to the establishment of Yellowstone also calls into question the American claim to have established the first national park. So what does Africa have to do with all of this? Once set, the idea of wilderness from the U.S. and the national park ideal began to travel. More specifically, the idea of establishing spaces of wilderness, of protecting or really creating wild spaces, was exported to the African colonies in the late 19th century. At the time, there was a transatlantic discussion among USers and Europeans concerning the new African colonies and the need to save their wild spaces. This is the end of this video. Go on to the video for part 2.